Okay, so when it comes to risk evaluation, what we're talking about here is being able to define as a set of guidelines and procedures to help us to identify and assess the risks that pose a threat to the business or the environment. There are several steps that are involved to identify and prioritize security risks to determine the probability and magnitude of the possible threat, the vulnerability, or the risk associated with the system itself. Now, most of the time, risk assessments for new systems are conducted when the system is beginning its development life cycle. For existing systems, we conduct the evaluation when major modifications are made. So let's talk about some of those things we need to look at. First of all, you'll need to go through and make sure you understand what the system characteristics are. Now here we go through and look at the limits of an IT system that are basically determined in order to set the scope of that risk. The information we need to help us to identify the risks that the system can create for us would include things like the system's processing environment, like a hardware inventory of that machine, or how it's connected. Who are the users of that system? What are the objectives of that system? What software is loaded on that system? How data flows in and out. Basically, you're going to pretend like you're the IRS and you're auditing me. You're going to find out everything about the target. The next step is the threats identification, or the threat ID. This step, different threats and threat sources need to be identified. So typically we look at human threats like eavesdropping or shoulder surfing or espionage. We look at then technical threats, which include things like breaking passwords for unauthorized access, or malicious code infection, or spam and mail fraud, or denial of service attacks. We'd also want to determine the motivation and the action of the threat. We then would want to move on to step 3, which has us covering the identification of vulnerabilities. Now, the main objective here is to prepare a list of information system vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a threat source. And we can answer that through a lot of the times documentation provided by the vendor, if the vendor has advisories that they put out, or system software security analysis, even previous risk assessment reports or previous pen tests or security and evaluations on that system. Next, we have control analysis. The controls that are planned to be implemented or already implemented are analyzed by your team in order to kind of reduce the probability of a threat. Now, this involves looking or analyzing things like control methods, both technical and non-technical. Also control categories like preventative controls as well as detective controls. After we've evaluated that, we then want to look at the likelihood of the occurrence of that threat. Now, there are several factors that could help you actually figure out what the overall likelihood would be. That would include things like motivation, nature of the vulnerability, and the efficiency and existence of current controls in place. Now, typically we break down these likelihoods down to high, medium, and low. I'm pretty sure you can figure out what those definitions are. We then move into impact analysis. At this step, we're trying to determine the adverse impact resulting from a successful breach. Now, the impact analysis should include things like loss of integrity, loss of availability, or even loss of confidentiality. And again, the magnitude of impact would be rated from a high, medium, and also a low. So the next step, risk determination, is actually quite critical in this whole effort. It's kind of complex, and that's because it depends upon various tangible and intangible factors. Now, it can sometimes be difficult to determine what those factors are, but overall, it involves considering the following. 1, looking at the probability of the occurrence of the incident. 2, again, tangible and or intangible impact of the incident on the organization resource. 3, the control measures that we would use to minimize the impact or totally avoid the incident. The next step includes control recommendations. Now, this is actually the main purpose of the whole risk evaluation. This is where we're going to go through and recommend the controls based on the likelihood and or impact and how critical the risk may be for the business itself. Now, when trying to determine the control recommendations, you should look at the following factors. The control should meet the basic principle of a cost-benefit ratio. Also, controls should be implemented within the company's ethics and security policy, or it could be implemented with minor updates in a policy. The recommended solution should also be compatible with the existing organization's system. And of course, controls should never ever go against the safety requirements of personnel or resources. And of course, after we've gathered all this information, you know what the next step is, right? It's always about documentation. So we're going to document our results. You should make sure that the report can help senior management in talking about decisions on policies, procedures, and management changes. Make sure that the report or your documentation makes sense and is written toward the audience that it's being read by. Now, your goal is to make sure that it contains the information that would make it helpful for senior management to implement mitigation strategies and associate the resource to mitigate the risks in order to reduce potential losses. In other words, we've got to dumb it down so the non-geeks can read it and understand it.